we spoke about this remarkable story, and we had these two different ways of interpreting it. Just looking at little minor details about how we can interpret the story on a deeper level, explaining how, in both of them, we explained how the relationship between the soul and God is similar to the conversation between Elisha and the Shunammite woman, or excuse me, the woman whose wife is the wife of the prophet. And she's struggling with her lack of inspiration. She's struggling with her lack of drive and passion in connection with Hashem. And God's response to her is that you need to refocus, bring yourself back in your house, so to speak. You have to recognize that you have a house, you have a home, you have a place which is your central place. And then you need to fill up these empty vessels. And we said that the empty vessels have several different ways of looking at it. Number one is doing your mitzvot and studying your Torah, even though right now it feels empty, eventually you will fill up. And then we spoke about also the idea that a person has to look at themselves as themselves an empty vessel. And themselves an empty vessel means basically empty yourself of your ego, put yourself aside. And this is basically the idea of teshuvah, to return to God, to be absorbed, so to speak, in God, instead of to be self-absorbed, focused on our own issues, our own struggles, our own desires and focus. And as a result of that, we're going to live on the extra. Tichyu banotar. Tichyu banotar. You'll be able to live on the extra, on the remnants. So we're going to explain that the idea of notar, we explained that the idea of notar spiritually is the idea of sovev kolam. So there are two different ways that God creates the world. One is the idea of God creating the world as he is involved in every single detail, as he permeates every single detail, enlivens every detail, gives every detail its capability to exist in its own framework. So the whale, of course, with all of its needs, gets exactly what it needs. At the same time, the krill, of course, gets what it needs. On the other side of things, you also have that's in terms of something that's alive. The differences between something that's absolutely massive and something that's basically microscopic. But then you also have minerals and how minerals develop and all that kind of thing versus human beings and with our capability of dealing with everything that we are. So all of those things are as God permeates the world. And so this is through an energy called mimale kolamin, that Hashem fills the world. And this is not just the physical world, but each of the spiritual worlds are giving their energy, their spiritual vivation, their vitality based on their individual needs. The massive according to the massive needs, the minute according to the minute needs, and each one in its own world. Sovev kolamin is the second energy. And this energy means surrounds the world. This is as God is. God, of course, does not need the world. The world needs God. And from this supernal perspective, and we're going to talk about this supernal perspective in a separate mimer that we'll learn later, but from this broader perspective, in God's mind, so to speak, there is absolutely no difference between the earth and the entire Milky Way. There's no difference even between the entirety of the universe, the physical universe as we know it, in comparison with the greatest of spiritual worlds. They're all the same. And Tanya uses the term, he explains this is one of the statements that we say every single day, kulam bechachma asita, that you have created everything with wisdom, and he explains it slightly differently. He says, in reference to God, the highest levels of chachma vatzilus, the highest levels of spirituality within the reference and within the framework of the chain of creation is the exact same thing as Asiya, as the exact same thing as this physical world of action. Because for God, all of these things are all creations. And all creations are basically just, if you want to look at it this way, figments of God's imagination. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm saying that just in conceptually, God creates everything at every single moment. So from this more massive perspective, everything is equal. It's the great equalizer. Everything is basically nothing. Soviv Kalalmin, God transcends the world, God is beyond the world, and he gives all of them this energy as well. Why does God need to create both of them? He create with both of these energies. So in a separate mimer, the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Chabad, explains something very interesting. He says, if God were only to create with Memale and give each individual item or each individual life form or whatever it is, its particular needs and its particular spiritual energy to be able to exist, and that's it, we would have no capacity to be able to transcend. We would have no ability to be able to perceive something that's beyond ourselves. All we would see is our own limitation, and that's it. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, Rabbi, are you talking about existentialist thought? Is that what you're describing?
I'm not sure that this is existentialist in concept, because I think Chassidus does not focus on one versus the other. It combines all. Okay.
All right.
So on a broader perspective, is an existentialist element of it.
An element. Okay. That's what okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's see. So in order to be able to allow us the ability to be able to transcend, God has to create with Sovev as well. Now, if God were only to create with Sovev, we would not be able to exist as self beings, as individuals, as separate beings. Because what is Sovev is so intense, the truth of godliness is so obvious and apparent, and I don't want to use the term visible because we're not talking about something that's seeable with the eyes, but it's so clear that if Sovev were to be revealed in our world, we would not be able to exist as separate beings. We would not be able to perceive our own separateness, and we would not be able to make the choices that we do, good and bad. That's not the point of the world. And so therefore, we need to be able to have Memale giving us our individualism as well. So there's this combination of the two of them. Memale is the one that is relatable, is the element of God which is relatable. It gives us our energy, it gives us our life, it gives us our existence within our frameworks. And Sovev is the ability to be able to transcend. And like I said, in the next mimer that we'll learn, we'll go into these ideas a little bit more in depth. But we want to focus today on Sovev. Sovev has several ideas that we actually have the ability to be able to connect with. And number one, we're talking about the idea of Teshuvah. Go ahead, Mr. Resnick, you have a question?
Yes. Are you talking about all Sovev?
Yes, Sovev, yeah.
Yeah. When you say Sovev, it's all Sovev.
Sovev, that's correct. The encompassing light, the energy, and there's actually reasons why it's referred to as light, and there's reasons why it's called energy. Just to summarize that conversation, the word "oh," which is light, has certain advantages to it. light is the removal of something from the luminary. The luminary is that which is giving light. And light is the implication of the fact that there is a luminary. As soon as you block off its connection with its source, the light ceases to exist. It no longer exists. And so that's the reason why when we talk about God's energy, we use the term O in general instead of the word koach. Because koach, energy, is something that is dependent not just on the source, but on anything that happens afterwards. So koach, for example, if I throw a ball, so as soon as I've thrown the ball, my koach is no longer impacting it. In other words, I threw it, now it's impacted by wind, it might be impacted by a baseball bat, it might be impacted by gravity. Greater gravitational forces will obviously give it, cause it to fall faster and all that kind of thing. And so the word koach is a weaker term to be able to describe God's energy. And that's the reason why we use the term light. And there are, of course, advantages to using the term koach, but we don't want to go into that right now. But yes, in general, when we're talking about the term sovev, we're talking about the ora sovev, the transcendent light, the encompassing light, all those things. So there are certain ways for us to be able to tap into the ora sovev. Even though it is transcendent, even though it is beyond us, there are certain ways for us to be able to do so. And one of the ways to be able to do so is through teshuvah, and that's what we're going to discuss over here. The reason why teshuvah comes from the ora sovev is because in general, when you're talking about memale, everything's systematic. And when you're talking about all of Judaism, all of the expectations within Judaism, everything is systematic. You're expected to do X, Y, and Z. You can't change a Wednesday into a Shabbat. Shabbat starts at exactly a particular time. It ends at exactly a particular time. Everything has its system. Pig will never be kosher. Now, what happens if I eat pig? So I have absorbed something that is not kosher. I have brought that into myself, and now myself has been impacted by something that is not kosher. Now along comes teshuvah. Teshuvah, of course, means to return. So by the process of teshuvah, I actually supersede the system. I actually go beyond this system. I go straight into God's ultimate mercy, which is beyond any system and has nothing to do with how good I am, how bad I am, or anything like that. I say, God, I'm going straight to you. And as a result of that, it's not even just that we ask forgiveness for God and God says, okay, don't do it again. I forgive you. But teshuvah is actually incorporates the idea of kapara. Kapara means atonement, in which you eliminate the negativity. So you retroactively delete what happened in the past. It no longer exists. And along with that is an even greater thing, an even greater level that we can aspire to and we can reach at some point, in which, because of our deep desire to connect to God, we can have the ability to be able to cause all of our even intentional sins to themselves become merits because of the fact that we use that energy to inspire us to grow beyond wherever we had been in the past. And so this is something that's a transcendent experience. And this is as we connect into Sovev. This is as we connect into the transcendent. This is as we connect into an element beyond ourselves completely. And so this is really what we're going to focus on here. The Rebbe wants to know, how can we live off of Tichi Banotar? How can you live off of Sovev? How can you live off of Teshuvah? And chapter 4, that's the question that he begins with, and he asks this question here. But it seems that there are two extremes being expressed here. On the one hand, we are stating that as a result of this process, the process, of course, one falling and collapsing, so to speak, in their spiritual awareness and connection and drive in Judaism. And then afterwards, the growth that happens as a result of it. One will be able to be energized from the lofty spiritual heights of Sovev, which we refer to as the remnant, which by its nature is encompassing and aloof beyond details, but at the same time, we can draw that into our own personal service of God. How is that possible? How are we able to live off of the transcendent? How are we able to use that on a daily basis? And the Rebbe explains this beautifully, and he says this can be understood based on the Maimar of the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe, in which he explains the famous verse, "The mitzvah that I command you today is not beyond or distant from you, it is very close to you in your mouth and heart to do it. Ki ha-mitzvah azot, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom, lo nifleiti mimcha, v'lo rechoka hi, ki karov elecha hadavar me'od, beficha ubilvavcha lasoto." Very, very, very famous verse. Well, the Rebbe actually took this verse and made it into one of his 12 kind of what statements of being, so to speak. He created an organization called Tzivos Hashem, which is a children's club, and he gave the children the responsibility to study and memorize 12 sayings coming from across Judaism. 5 of them were psukim, 4 of them are from Mishnah texts and from the Talmud, and 3 of them are from Tanya. And this is one of the psukim, this is one of the verses that he chose. It's very easy for you to do it in your mouth and in your heart. This is, of course, the center text of the entire book of Tanya, where he's trying to explain how is it very easy, how is it very close to us. So not looking into the whole conversation in Tanya, but just looking into the actual, the commentaries on the verse itself, which is a verse coming from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. And of course, the majority of the book of Devarim is Moses' final speech. So it's very interesting. The way beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, he says, is that Moshe be'eret HaTorah azot. Moshe explained the entire Torah. The first 4 books are very, very, very difficult to understand. What exactly does God want? Who is God? What's going on? What's the conversation? What's the relationship or anything like that? They seem like they're just stories and random laws. And they're very, very difficult to understand in the context of a broader context of a religion. Moshe, in the book of Devarim, takes the ideas that are core to the religion and puts them out and say, focus on these concepts. That's where you have Shema Yisrael. That's where you have a lot of the essential faith elements of Judaism are found in Devarim. And this verse is one of these things. And basically Moshe is saying, look, guys, God's not asking you to go up to the heavens. God's not asking you to go across seas or anything like that. It's very easy for you to do. So to continue in the text, according to many of the commentators, Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about the mitzvah of teshuvah in this verse. But why does this mitzvah in particular suddenly need to be clarified that it is not beyond or distant from you? After all, it had already been given as a mitzvah 40 years earlier at the giving of the Torah. In addition, this mitzvah is not just any one individual mitzvah, it is actually an all-inclusive mitzvah, which corrects and fills whatever spiritual defects or lacks from the past. In fact, the Alter Rebbe explains the Talmudic term teshuvah u'masim tovim, teshuvah and good deeds. And the Alter Rebbe, of course, asks the question, why would the Talmud say teshuvah before good deeds? You would think that it should be masim tovim u'teshuvah, that a person needs to do teshuvah if they screwed up. But masim tovim, of course, you have to do every single day. Good deeds are part of who we are. And the Alter Rebbe explains that the reason the Talmud chooses this order of the phrase is to clarify that the priority given to teshuvah causes one's deeds to be good and luminescent. In other words, when a person lives a life of teshuvah, their deeds are not just deeds that are just done, but their deeds themselves become good. They're filled with goodness. So teshuvah is a critical element of Judaism. It is an essential idea. It is an all-inclusive mitzvah because it includes absolutely everything that's in there. And suddenly, 40 years after Judaism has already been kind of rolling along, Moshe needs to get up and say, oh, by the way, this is not so difficult. It's not so hard for you. So let's start with chapter 5, just to be able to answer the question. We only have 5 more minutes, but we'll be able to at least answer the question. So the Rebbe answers the question by noting that, in fact, there are elements of Torah and mitzvot that are nifleit v'rechoka. There are elements of Judaism that are, in fact, distant and beyond us. And Moshe is saying he is negating their lack of relevance to us. In other words, what he's saying is that, yes, they are, in fact, distant. They are, in fact, transcendent. They are, in fact, beyond you because we're just minute human beings. But lo nifleiti mimcha, they're not distant from you because of who you are. That's going to be his answer. Because of who
Could you please
we are.
repeat that? Could you please repeat that again?
That there are elements of Judaism that are transcendent, but because of who we are as Jews, therefore he's saying, Lo nifleiti mimcha, they are not distant from you because you're a Jew.
Okay.
Because you have a unique ability because of who you were created and how you were created. Therefore, they are not, even though they are transcendent from the world, they are beyond the world, but they are not transcendent from you. And that's what we're going to answer. And so to break this down a little bit, he explains, he says, Torah has 2 different levels. You have the Torah, study of Torah, which is God's wisdom, and the practical application of Torah in the halachot and the mitzvot of Torah, which are God's will. So wisdom and will. Torah, being intellectual and therefore absorbable into our minds, is an experience of innerness, what we refer to as or pnimi, an inner light. We have the ability to be able to understand ideas, and we have the ability to be able to bring those ideas into ourselves, into the point where we're capable of associating those ideas with our behavior. We're able to direct our lives in accordance with it. We're able to explain the ideas to other people, and the ideas become part of us. And that's something that we absorb into our own minds. We now understand it. We now have brought it into our own selves. So that is an inner experience, an absorbable experience where we make it part of ourselves. On the other hand, mitzvot are something completely different. While mitzvot, being garments in which one's soul clothes itself, is an experience of transcendence or makif. Okay? When we shake a lulav and etrog, we are doing something with our hands. Kabbalah tells us what we're accomplishing when we're shaking the lulav and etrog. Kabbalah explains to us that we are drawing down the element of dat into our in connecting Zah and Malchut in a particular way. For the Kabbalists here, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. but I did something, I don't necessarily fully relate to what I did. I might conceptually know what I'm trying to do. I may conceptually understand the representation of the four species and what they are, but I did something, but it's not quite me. Study of Torah, when I've associated the idea into my own mind, it becomes part of me. When I do a mitzvah, I am doing something. I'm doing something with a limb of my body, shaking the lulav from using my hands. I'm bringing it towards my chest. When I put on tefillin, I'm using my arm and my head. But that's something that I have not been able to absorb into myself. It's something that I'm doing with something else. It's an or makif. And he explained this in a little bit more detail. He says there are even two levels of transcendence. You have makif akarov, which is something that is beyond but relative to oneself, like clothes. So we have ourselves, and then we have something that encompasses us. So we put on a jacket, the jacket encompasses me, and that's something that is close to me. And that basically flexes with everything that I do. And so basically it feels like it's part of me, as long as it fits well, as long as it's not bulky or anything like that. It basically is makif karov. It's something that is outside of myself, but it's something close. There's also makif harachok, something that is beyond and distant, like a house. That's something that also transcends. There's also something that surrounds me, but it's not something that I fully identify with. I don't walk around with my house. So likewise, with regards to the mitzvot, there are certain mitzvot which are close by, more relatable, and there are certain mitzvot which are really far more transcendent. And there are even those mitzvot which are transcendent beyond what we refer to as makif harachok. So we can see from this, because we're really running out of time, and I apologize, I'll finish this little paragraph.
If you don't keep
We
it
therefore
up, I'm not going to get it.
there are that are distant, and so the question is, how can we relate to these things? Go ahead, Mrs. Resnick.
All these things
Go ahead.
that you're speaking, all of these things that you're speaking about that are external to us, then by having it surrounding you or on you or within it, these all become a part of your experience, in which case then doesn't that also become a part of you?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's exactly the point. When the first time we do it, it is something that feels distant, but then over time, we're able to try to absorb it more and more and more, and to try to bring it within much more and more. And that's kind of where we're going on this, that we have the ability to be able to bring the transcendence into us through teshuvah.
Right, because it becomes a part
Really,
of your memory.
more than just memory, it becomes part of your being.
Right.
In other words, it's not just an intellectual, it's a spiritual something that fills you up. And so it's a different experience. Really, the way I would look at this whole thing is that there's a big difference between doing mitzvot just because you were told to do it, and living your entire life, let's say, as an Orthodox Jew, because that's what you do and that's what your culture. If you want to call it the Tevye mentality. The Tevye mentality is actually very problematic. I actually can't stand Fiddler in the Roof. And the reason why the Tevye mentality is very problematic is because there's no growth whatsoever. He's doing it because he was told that's what he was told to do, tradition. What here we're saying is that through teshuvah, and teshuvah here is relevant both to somebody who has sinned as well as to anybody, because the idea is regrowth and the ability to be able to transcend themselves and to draw that into yourself. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. So yes, there are things in Judaism that are distant and are beyond, but the point is that they're not beyond you, that we each one of us as Jews have the ability to be able to absorb that within. And we will continue that conversation, God willing, on Friday. Any other quick questions before we keep going? I know this is a difficult concept to end on, but hopefully we'll be able to continue.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Absolutely, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Sei gesund, Rabbi. Sei gesund.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gesundheit
Rabbi
stark.
Yeskin.